everyone. Hi, Mr. Yo. So, today I'm going to be talking about how language and reality are interconnected to each other. So, I was scrolling through Twitter and I came across this very interesting username and this very interesting claim that said that we are somehow at the mercy of the languages we speak. They shape and influence our behavior through and through. I read through the whole article on thelanguagenerds.com and then I thought to myself that there were so many instances where I had seen a joke and I could only laugh about it with another fellow Indian. I couldn't really explain that word to anyone who did not understand Hindi. Therefore, I wondered, does this happen to everyone across all cultures? I wondered, how big of a role does language play in my day to day life? And then finally, I came to think of, does language really change the way I look at the world altogether? Therefore, I came up with the knowledge question of, to what extent does our perception of reality depend on knowledge? So, the original knowledge claim seemed to talk about how language influences our behavior, but now I wanted to see how language influences our reality. So, after a lot of research that I'm going to be talking about in this presentation, my thesis statement is that our perception of reality is heavily dependent on language. I'll be talking about the WOK's language and sense perception and AOK's science, natural sciences, and economics. So, my first contention is the experiment from Yale University. In this experiment, they used continuous flash suppression and showed their participants several images and asked them what the images were of. Initially, the answers were wrong. However, hearing a verbal label before the simple detection task seemed to change performance drastically. When the shape of the stimulus and the shape of the denoted label matched in the participant's mind, their answers were correct. The language, which was the verbal cue, helped them create a picture of the stimulus, which thereby led them to correctly guess what the stimulus was. The words used helped the participants perceive their reality, which in this case was the shape of the stimulus. The scientists concluded that our reality is based on perception rather than reason. Words stimulate us to create our perceptions and therefore build our realities for us. In the AOK of natural sciences, sense perception is very important. The first step of scientific process, observation, is completely reliant on sense perception. The setting of an experiment is described by the vocabulary of the scientist. The language he or she uses to delineate his expression or his experiment is directly related to to his perception of his reality. For example, when we learned about cells in our IB bio class, we learned that Robert Hooke initially described the word cells as small rooms. Therefore, every time we see a cell today under a microscope, we always see them as little tiny cubicles like the small rooms as Robert Hooke identified for us. His words have become our reality now. Finally, we see that language does shape our reality. Language triggers our sense perception skills through creating an image in our brains. And this image in our brain is what our reality is. Moving on to argument number 2, which is cross linguistic influence. By this, I am talking about how the way a language is structured can change a person's view on the world and certain topics. The first example is from Ralph Strauch's The Reality Illusion. You guys can read the quote for yourself. So, the Nootka Indians in the Pacific Northwest speak in a language only consisting of verbs. This might be peculiar to think of in English because we pay a heavy emphasis on nouns. Therefore, Strauch wrote in this quotation in his book, which shows us how the Nootka look at life completely differently just because they use so many adjectives in their language. When we think in English, we automatically tell our brains to think in terms of subjects and objects, in terms of mind and matter, or in other words, in terms of things, in terms of nouns, not verbs like the Nootkas. That is why we see the world as something stationary while the Nootka sees them as transient events because they use so many verbs. Furthermore, a similar example is Carol Kahn in her article Nuclear Language and How We Learn to Pad the Bomb. Once again, please read the quotation yourself. but she's referring to the quotation to her experience in the Center of Psychological Studies in the Nuclear Age, where she lived for a year learning defense studies. This course had a very weird terminology because they didn't have the word peace in part of this course at all. The closest thing that got to it was strategic stability. Khan writes that while this was a disorienting experience in the beginning, she slowly grew into it and started thinking in it, as in she started thinking in this language. So the more time she spent with these people, the more time she spent with this language, the more her perception of her reality started disorienting. She also started believing that peace was not peace really, it was just strategic stability. So therefore, this is another example of how the language we surround ourselves with has a huge impact on what we see as reality. Now, let's move on to my counter argument, which is from Tom Lubach. He wrote this quotation in his memoir where he talks about his gradual loss of language as a result of a brain tumor that blocked his language cortices. His perspective is of someone who does not have language at all. He cannot speak language, and what he talks about in this quotation is how not speaking a language does not really bother him and doesn't change his view on the world. However, in a research by Dr. Dorarditsky, she establishes that language impacts how we look at mundane things around us. For example, Dorarditsky discovered that Germans described the word bridge as elegant and beautiful because it was feminine in their language, whilst conversely, Spanish speakers use male adjectives like sturdy and strong because it was masculine in theirs. Once again, this proves to us how the constitution of a language changes the way one might view day to day things around us. Furthermore, researchers from UC San Diego say that words in economics not only describe a problem, but they also shape up a solution for us. For example, when we use the word stalled in economics, it means a short term financial stimulus can help the economy. However, when we use the word ailing, like a sick patient, it requires constant long term care. This difference over here is crucial. So, now going to the conclusion, through this experiment, we can certainly say that language shapes up our reality to a great extent. I've talked about the experiment done at Yale, where the researchers concluded that language helps us visualize an image in our mind through sense perception, and that picture in our brains is what our reality is. The argument with the cross linguistic influences further showed us how the composition and the structure of a language can completely affect our entire outlook on life. And finally, the counter argument and Dr. Boroditsky's research further strengthened my stance on language shaping up our reality. The tiny flaw in my conclusion might be when it comes to the AOK of visual arts. In visual arts, the language, in a way, is the artwork itself. So, does this mean that the artwork is our reality? I think that language just plays a very different role in the visual arts, but however, still on the majority, I think reality is heavily dependent on language, if not completely. Only in the visual arts, because it's a special case, might it make an exception. So, linking everything back to the real life situation, I think that the claim that was made on Twitter was 100% correct. I agree that reality is shaped up to a great extent by the language we surround ourselves with, be it our mother tongue or any other language that we speak at school or we speak most of the times. When we cannot explain something to another person that is from our mother tongue, that is just probably because we both have a very different perception of our reality. Moving on to our perception or to my implications, the first one that I chose was a culture shock. We might experience a disorienting feeling during migration because our languages have shaped up the way we look at the world to a great extent. So, all of a sudden, when we move amongst a different language, obviously our perception of reality is going to change. So it's going to take us a lot of time to get adjusted to the new perception of reality because this new country, this new language proposes a new perception of reality altogether. And furthermore, I just want to talk about translators and how complicated their jobs can be in implication too. Translators always have to translate ideas and concepts from one language to another. But as we understood today, these languages are have all these languages have a big impact on our perception of reality. So how is one person supposed to translate a sense of reality on their own? How are they supposed to cater to both sides at the same time? So that's why I think that translators have a very difficult job, a very complicated job, which encourages them to be educated about both the language and how the language has a different perception of reality. Only once the translator knows about the language and knows about the perceptions of reality that it imposes can one person translate a language or a particular thought or a particular idea effectively. So that was it for my presentation. Thank you guys for listening and watching. And this is my bibliography. Thank you.